where one of our allies is a association of community organizers. They have a professional association with 90-some members who are all trained community organizers. And every time I go over there, I make it a point to go meet them just because I love the fact of, you know, COPA-K, as they call themselves, the Community Organizer Practitioners Association of Kenya. Like, there might be some in some other country, and if any of you organize one, my dues are in the mail. I'm joining as soon as you put it together. I think that's a wonderful thing. The other thing, the other book that's up here talks even more blatantly about, I think, part of what the depth and strength of Acorn's experience in organizing was. And there's no way not to see, you know, one of our signal accomplishments being the sort of test of character in the organization in the way that all parts of the organization responded to the crisis that Katrina represented in New Orleans 7 years ago in August 29th of 2005. Like any big organization, we had unions, we had housing, we had community organization, we had people that did this in New York. Our headquarters was in New Orleans, and it was one of those kinds of things. Had I worked there 38 years or 100 years, I think this would still be on my top list, where everyone in the organization responded in understanding that we had members there. These members were now everywhere throughout the diaspora, and this was a time for all parts of the organization to be at their best. And that was reflected in the amount of money that was raised for the recovery, the number of people who called and were willing to volunteer, the people who organized in their offices where Katrina people were coming to welcome them into Houston and Atlanta and Little Rock and San Antonio and Dallas and everywhere else. And part of what we looked at was the real threat that as any crisis and disaster occurs, there's an open opportunity for people with power to sort of reconfigure the map, to look at the game differently, to change the rules. So in many cases, issues that had long ago been settled, the governance of schools, the development in neighborhoods, were all of a sudden front and center. ULI, the Urban Land Institute, was contracted to bring in, and they came up with a plan within 6 months, or within actually 3 months of the storm, that recommended that whole neighborhoods simply not be redeveloped, go back to Cedar Swamp. And they had a way of trying to describe that like it was, you know, any of you watch the History Channel? Swamp People? This is not the Swamp People crowd, I don't think. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Although in Youngstown the other night, these organizers took me to this bar, and just, you know, so that I've had a local experience. And here at this big bar, it's kind of like a biker's bar. I mean, there were all these motorcycles outside. You kind of had to walk your way through the flesh to get in there. And then what do they have on the two huge screens? And I know this seems like a diversion. I can't help myself. On one screen is the History Channel. And they're watching, you know, Antique Pickers, or, you know, there's all these shows now on the History Channel. It wasn't Swamp People, I would have watched it too, but it was, you know, and then on the other channel, OWN. Oprah Winfrey, I didn't even know anybody. Oprah doesn't think anybody watching that station, but in this bar, you know, these bunch of thugs down there in Youngstown, they just, and they'd be sitting there, didn't have the sound on, but his is like March Madness, or just like basketball games, and that's the whole 3.5 hours we were there. Those channels didn't change. They, you know, I even asked the barmaid, what's this with the History Channel OWN? And she looked at, no, I guess somebody likes it. You know? The point being that the plan was not to allow people to come back home. It was a classic organizing issue that we see frequently in international work, which is the right to return, whether or not you have the right to go back to your home place. And it was very interesting to compare the experience after the tsunami in Indonesia with one of the partners we had there. Same kind of problem. They represented all these fisher people, yet they wanted them to rebuild their houses 2 miles from the shore. Well, exactly how does a fisher family live 2 miles from water, which is, I mean, the bottom line is, and where this book sort of ends its main narrative, is at the point when the mayor and all the powers that be in New Orleans finally are going to announce how they're going to spend money on the recovery. And that was when we found out which neighborhoods would live and die, and the only people who weren't elected officials were actually the leaders of Acorn, particularly in the Ninth Ward and the lower Ninth Ward, who were invited and actually were briefed earlier. We all had to keep our mouths shut. That they were asked to look at the map and actually be there. There's a picture in the front page of our hometown paper where one of our leaders is pointing to the map and another one is pointing to the map, and the mayor, and then another picture is getting on his knees, and one of those, I hope it's okay, to our leaders. And a commitment of $138 million, the most of any of the neighborhoods, to rebuild that community. And that, it's a good thing I stopped the book there, because there's been nothing but, hard sliding and hard work since then trying to get the damn money. But regardless, that was a good place to stop it. And unfortunately, there have been lots of disasters we see in organizing, and we don't always get to respond. But it spoke to the fundamental character of the organization and the organizing model, that as a membership organization, there was no such thing about talking about bricks and mortars and where did you find that church, or what was that institution like, or you knew you had to find those 6,000 members. And the fact that there were real relationships and that they were able to call, text, do whatever to try to bring back so many people into that city and still continue that work. And I don't know how it works everywhere. I mean, they actually, that organization is now called A Community Voice, so they actually share, co-house with us, and in good times we pay their rent, in bad times they pay their rent. It's, I guess it's the opposite. Somehow the rent gets paid and we always pay it. I'm pretty sure that's how it works, but I still hear the phone calls. Yeah, A Community Voice. A Community Voice, we're calling, Acorn. It's A Community Voice. So, the rebranding still is a project in many places. So that's what these books are about, and that's what gives me the excuse to have, to talk to these bookstore people and say, hey, do you mind if we come and have a conversation about books and talk about organizing and, get some different people in the room, and that's why it's such a pleasure to have the excuse to be here. So I will answer any question about the books or about what you're thinking or whatever, but as I already argued, part of why I do this is to get a feeling for what people are thinking. And as you can tell, I actually still think that the biggest strength for an organizer is listening. So just being out there, you start to learn about a fascinating campaign about this Clean Rivers in Pittsburgh, it turns out. And this in Youngstown, I learned they have here's what they were just able to do in Youngstown. I was just sharing this with my new colleague, Jasmine Rivera, here as we were coming in from the airport. But on this $26 million fake settlement on the bank foreclosure money, part of what they were able to do was leverage up in Ohio and the Attorney General there to direct $75 million of the share they're getting in Ohio towards abandoned home demolition, which is allowing them in these sort of, hollowed out cities like Youngstown, Warren, I mean, you just name a city in the industrial belt, to finally get rid of some of those houses that are in the way of the land and repurpose it and start to be able to come up with another program. So that's interesting. I hadn't heard about that. That's obviously a very unique and innovative campaign. So you never know.
So I think, Acorn was an enormous, an important part of our democratic fabric in this country.
Yeah.
Being the voice of working people, low-income people, right? And the takedown, I think we're still, as a movement, recovering. I think being an organizer is, I think one thing that I sort of try to hold to as an organizer is that you can't lose focus, right?
Absolutely.
And it sounded like you guys were always driving for the next victory, but at the same time, maybe not paranoid enough. And even paranoids have real enemies. So in the sort of post-mortem, what are the lessons learned from that?
You asked me whether or not we should have been more paranoid?